Now it works. Dear ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome. I would like to ask you to take your seat so that we can start. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the latest conference of the Bridge Forum Dialogue today. We have a very distinguished and interesting speaker with us here this evening. It is my honor to welcome Mr Moscovici, the first president of France's Cour des Comptes. The longer the pandemic has lasted, the clearer it has become that we cannot do without personal exchanges of views and perspectives. I'm therefore delighted to see so many of you here this evening. But I'm equally happy to have so many guests joining us remotely, including colleagues from other Supreme Audit institutions. The pandemic has had very few positive sides, of course. However, it has forced us to explore new ways of working and communicating with each other, and some of these are going to stay. Organizing this conference in a hybrid format now makes it possible for people from far to join our debate. As you may know, the Bridge Forum Dialogue is a non-profit organization which was established in Luxembourg to serve as a platform for interdisciplinary debate. It aims to link the European institutions based in Luxembourg with the country's financial, economic, political and social life. Although Luxembourg is a small member state, it has found its place at the heart of the Union. I therefore firmly believe that the topics we are discussing here can be of relevance throughout the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr Moscovici has been first president of France's Supreme Audit Institution since June 2020. He joined the Cour des Comptes as a junior auditor in 1984 after graduating from the École Nationale d'Administration. In the almost 4 decades in between, Mr. Moscovici has also had various high offices both in France and in the European Union. In 1994, we were both elected as members of the European Parliament for the first time. In 1997, Mr. Moscovici then became a member of France's National Assembly and was appointed Minister for European Affairs. In 2004, he was re-elected as a member of the European Parliament and served as one of its vice presidents. In 2007 and again in 2012, he was re-elected as a member of France's National Assembly and appointed Minister of Economy and Finance until 2014, when he became European Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, Taxation and Customs, an office he held until 2019. I believe it is this extensive experience as legislator and member of government at both the national and European levels that makes Mr. Moscovici such a valuable speaker for the topic we will be discussing this evening. The future of the European Union cannot be discussed without taking account of the perspective of its member states and, of course, of the French perspective in particular. France has always been at the forefront of European integration as one of its driving forces. More and more countries have joined the Union over the years, and we are all equal partners. However, the European Union depends on some members to pave the way so that others can join them. It is clear that Europe needs unity now more than ever. As well as the economic, financial and health crises that have buffeted the Union in recent years, we have also been under increasing attack from forces, both internal and external, which may not share our values and understanding of what it means to live together in Europe. I firmly believe that the Union offers individual member states their only possibility of making their voices heard in a rapidly changing global arena of trade and geopolitics, where they would otherwise be marginalized by bigger players, both old and new. The idea of the Union is now more relevant than ever, particularly since events took such a dramatic turn almost a month ago. The Russian Federation's brutal invasion of the sovereign state of Ukraine is primarily a terrible act of aggression. but it is equally a humanitarian disaster for the people of Ukraine. It also poses a threat to our European values and to the peace and security for which our Union stands. At the same time, however, European unity seems to have grown even closer in the face of this threat. The war in Ukraine has affected everyone and everything. The European international community of supreme order institutions is also making its voice heard. Our thoughts are naturally with our colleagues at the Accounting Chamber of Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not want to take up any more of your time. You will have an opportunity to ask questions and contribute to the discussion both in this room and remotely after Mr Moscovici's speech. I now look forward to what promises to be a stimulating discussion with valuable insights into the future of the European Union from someone who has made a major contribution to shaping it in recent decades. Thank you very much. Pierre, the floor is yours.
Dear President of the Court of Auditors, dear friend, President Lehner, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today at the Bridge Forum Dialogue, which I know to be a very prestigious forum, and especially in front of you. I'm honored to meet committed actors like you who are involved in the political and economic life of their own country, but also of Europe. I'm all the more delighted of the topic, which brings us today. It's very dear to me, I would say, for a long time. As you probably know it, the theme of my presentation today is about the future of Europe. I've made, during the last 25 years, so many speeches about the future of Europe. But today, I think, well, the topic is really relevant. I can only celebrate this relevance in this crucial context. I'm, of course, referring to the resurgence of war on the European continent and the new threats it represents to our democratic space. I always define Europe as our house of freedom and democracy, and we are clearly under attack and under threat. Attacking Ukraine, attacking this part of Europe is also threatening us, attacking us. This new geopolitical situation sets this conference in this totally radically changed context. Russia's violation of international law and of Ukrainian sovereignty has led to a war with disastrous human, we see it every day, and economic consequences for our entire continent, but first and foremost for the Ukrainian people. And here, in this very comfortable place, we must always remember how much they suffer and the tragedy they endure. The images we see and those we don't see show crimes that must not be forgiven. We must continue to show in this context our unity and our willingness to act together with strength and determination in all areas. Being in Luxembourg today, I would like to highlight that. In the Union's historical construction, your country has been at the center of European integration from the very beginning, both through the commitment of individuals and through the presence of several community institutions and bodies on its territories. Being there, I can only remember how many times I've been on the other side of the road in the building of the council since I've been sitting there for 7 years, first as a European Affairs Minister and then as a finance minister. More than that, I almost forgot my 5 years as a commissioner, where I also stood in the building, and so many press conferences with Klaus Regling here present we've held on the other side of the road. Among the founding fathers of the European Union, we can of course mention Joseph Beck, former Prime Minister of Luxembourg. He was actively involved in the creation of the Benelux Customs Union and later the European Coal and Steel Community. He played an important role in the preparation of the 1955 Messina Conference, which paved the way for the creation of the European Economic Community in 1958. And also a particular thought for my old friend Jean-Claude Juncker, whom I had the privilege to meet a few minutes ago. I was a member of his commission, and I can tell you how great he was, the president of the commission. This country can be very proud of him and his predecessors, former presidents of the commission. Today, we must not forget, and we must never forget, that Europe is not a given, and that it never will be. We must collectively be careful to protect this construction, which is unique, and its values, which are not shared all around the world. I cannot talk about this issue without mentioning where we are now. Peace is one of the founding principles of the EU, even if the youngest of our citizens tend sometimes to forget it, since they've always, until the 24th of February, lived in peace. But we united for that, to say never again, especially between France and Germany, two countries who have fought each other during 3 wars for 70 years, 1870, and then First World War, Second World War. The war is not on Europe's doorstep. It is in Europe. Again, Russian actions in Ukraine, and the point is that it's not the first one. It lasts since 2014, and the tensions they have generated are a major source of destabilization. How can we not remember, sadly, this statement by the Romanian philosopher and writer Emil Cioran in 1973? He said, "In Europe, happiness ends in Vienna. Beyond that, curse upon curse, always." The violation of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty, the war launched by Putin, as well as Russia's military deployment in Ukraine, have led, and we must be proud of that, to strong reactions from the EU. They are unprecedented, and they include, as you know, individual and economic collective sanctions, as I will develop it later in my intervention. The message is strong, but it had to be commensurate with the Russian aggression. It took some courage, especially for our German friends who were not in this motto before. Yet the challenge of ending the crisis today is crucial for the future of Europe, but also for the future of democracies more generally. One point I want to introduce there is that the Ukraine crisis is very specific, but that it marks one more step in this strange century we're living in, which I could define as the era of crises. We've been through the financial crisis. We've been through the Greek crisis. We've been through the COVID crisis. We're living in a polycrisis, as Jean-Claude used to say. This crisis is as well sanitary on the one hand, it's economical, it's financial, it's military, it's democratic. Our democracies are under attack also. And we must face these crises all together. And when we think about building the future of Europe, that's what it's about. The crisis in Ukraine, thus, is very specific because it represents a paradigm shift in the world today. This is the axis I would like to develop throughout my speech. The Ukraine crisis is today the main challenge facing the European Union today, and the 24th of February 2022 will remain, I believe, a turning point in our human history, but it was more positive, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th November 1989. We have lived under the illusion of the end of history. Europe is now facing an unprecedented geopolitical crisis. Since the 90s, we've been living in this idea developed by Francis Fukuyama. We collectively believe that the end of the Cold War marked the victory forever of democracy and liberalism over other ideologies. We believe that we will live in perpetual peace. This idea, it must be admitted, has guided us in the deepening and widening of the European construction in 2004, 2007, and 2013. I see my old friend Werner Hoyer. We were European Affairs of our Minister of our countries together 25 years ago. And you remember, like me, Werner, what our task was then was to prepare enlargement. I'm not talking only about enlargement, reunification of the EU. Some doubted that it would be a good thing. I think it was an historical duty. And today, we clearly see that even if things are complicated, and they are complicated, with the rule of law, with Poland, with Hungary, with other countries too. Well, we were right to do so. We had to do so. Let's imagine that we wouldn't have enlarged Europe to the Baltic countries, to Poland, to Romania, to Slovakia. What would happen? Some say it's your fault. Putin only attacked because you chose to admit Ukraine in NATO. And why not the other countries in the EU and NATO? Let's imagine they wouldn't be today in the EU and NATO. We would have the risk of this confrontation inside Europe, closer even to us, and we would have abandoned those people. Nevertheless, we can now say that this end of history was an illusion, both politically and economically. First and foremost, this war represents the beginning of a crisis with disastrous humanitarian and social consequences. We have already more than 3 million people who have been forced to flee to neighboring countries to escape the fighting. The UN estimates that the most vulnerable people, those who do not have the means to escape the conflict, remain in Ukraine. We know that we might have some 10 million people moving inside the EU as refugees, and this might be a part of Putin's strategy now, since he finds it difficult to beat Ukraine militarily. He will maybe push people to leave the country to put some more pressure on us, the Europeans. At the same time, a million more people living in the affected areas are stranded. They are unwilling or unable to live. As a result, some estimate that 12 million people, which is nearly 30% of the population, are in need of life-saving humanitarian assistance, according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. For the first time, member states have decided to implement the 2001 directive on the reception of displaced persons. It will allow Ukrainian refugees to stay in the EU for up to 3 years, to work, to access the school system and to receive medical care. Europe is proving by this decision that it wants to go further than just military support to Ukraine. A total of some 500 million euros has been pledged to help civilians affected by the war. I'm quite proud that we are doing so. As I must say, I felt in deep sympathy with Madame Merkel in her speech in 2015 and 16, more than some speeches I heard in my own country. When we are facing that, we must be opened. That's one of our privileges. That's one of our characteristics. At the political level, Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a direct attack on democracy. The perspective of the absolute and definitive supremacy of the ideal of liberal democracy, which existed since the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, is definitely slipping away. We are, if we think about the future of Europe, we have to live with this confrontation between liberal democracies and autocratic regimes, and this will last. I don't know if we can define the future, the post-Ukraine situation as a Cold War. This is something that strategists will have to reflect upon. But obviously, this confrontation is there. It is there to last. Russia's expansionist project is, and we must be conscious of that, a permanent threat to democratic regimes. After this war, we won't go back to the normal that existed before. There will be another era. And what some thought to be an era of perpetual peace was just, sorry to say that, between brackets. It lasted for 30 years. But we need to be conscious that history, as Raymond Aron said, is tragic and will remain tragic. In the space of a few weeks, the return of war in Europe has shifted geopolitical lines around the world. And to use the word of both the French president and the German chancellor together, yes, I was speaking about a new era, that's it. Vladimir Putin has launched an offensive on Ukraine to prevent it from joining what we consider the Western camp, to stop its expansion eastwards. But who knows what the next steps in its campaign against Western values will be. And again, we must be in full solidarity with all the members of the EU and all the members of NATO. NATO will emerge stronger from this war. If not stronger, at least more necessary. And we be conscious that even if we have to build a European defense, it cannot be without link with NATO. We have to have our own tools, but they cannot be totally independent from NATO. They have to be interdependent. Will it be a European pillar of NATO? Will it be something different? This is for us to think about. In this new context, the entire world order is turned upside down. China is watching the current situation with great attention. Some are optimistic, some are pessimistic. For the pessimistic, they think that, well, China can consider that the US are now busy with us in Europe, and so it will be easier for them to have aggressive targets in the Asia-Pacific region, such as Hong Kong, already in a sad situation, and Taiwan. Some others, and among them, I must say, can estimate that China is realizing that it's not in Russia's situation. China is a global power. It's an economy which is deeply involved in globalization. It cannot live without globalization. Russia's GDP is comparable to Spain's GDP, to half of the Italian or French GDP. I cannot say it lives in autarky, but it's not something that is key for the middle class. China cannot live that way. And that's why I think that China's caution, even if they're not yet or not on the right side, is really meaningful. They are not left Vladimir Putin, but they are not involved, as some would fear they would be. China's abstention from the UN General Assembly's condemnation of Russia is also significant. If they foreshadow the balance of power in the future world order, they are a bad omen. Western sanctions, the decoupling of the Russian and European economies, and the fragmentation of globalization will logically favor rapprochement between Russia and China, which will seek to help Moscow by integrating it into the parallel international payment system that it is trying to set up. But will Russia accept to be totally dependent on China? Will China always accept to back Russia? These are still open questions. The 24th February 2022 also represents the start of an economic war that will have deep and lasting consequences at the European level, but also at the global level. The EU is already, as you know as well as I do, for you, some of you better, the EU is already facing rising energy and wheat prices, adding to the inflation already underway. As the OECD has shown in its recent publication on the Ukrainian crisis, the war is expected to both undermine global growth by 1% and to increase inflation by at least 2.5%. Commodity prices have risen sharply. Together, Russia and Ukraine account for about a third of global wheat exports and are major producers of fertilizer and metals used in industry. So there will be more supply side effects. Some bottlenecks will emerge that will reinforce the inflationary pressures. Disruptions in wheat, in maize, in fertilizer supplies also risk increasing global hunger and food insecurity, as well as raising prices. With Russia also accounting for around 60% of global natural gas supplies and 11% of oil deliveries, energy prices, as you know, have already risen alarmingly. In Europe, spot gas prices have increased more than tenfold from their level a year ago, with oil prices which have almost doubled over the same period. Our European energy dependence on Russia raises significant issues. I will come back to it in the context of the recent sanctions voted by member states in response to this crisis. If I would summarize, I would say that the Russian economy is not a global player, but it is a major energy and raw material supplier, and we've got to face this aspect of the challenge. Finally, the Russian economic situation adds significant instabilities to the global financial environment, and I know where I am Luxembourg is a very strong financial place. Among the many consequences of the European sanctions, rating agencies are considering the possibility of an imminent Russian default. This risk seems to be approaching with Russia's failure to meet its deadline for payment of 106 million euros of interest on its bonds a few days ago. Again, if it happens, it won't be the first time, and we are not that exposed. Our banks are not that exposed to Russian risks, but it will push further Russia towards China, and it will make Russia totally dependent on China, with all the consequences that can emerge from that. The Ukraine crisis is calling for coordinated and thorough responses from the EU, and I'm convinced that we can respond to this historical challenge, and that's the way we can build the EU of the future. This crisis, and the other crises we are living in, are a huge challenge for Europe, but the way we have dealt with it so far shows that Europe can learn from its mistakes and adapt. Gramsci had this line. He said, history teaches, but it has no pupil. Well, I'm not that sure that he was right, because European governments did not react, maybe in the most adequate way, to the financial crisis of 2008 and the sovereign debt crisis in the euro area from 2010 to 2012. We did finally, dear Klaus. We created tools that did not exist. We have changed our treaties. DSM is now a very, very strong mechanism and a very strong tool. And as a commissioner, we've had the occasion to work very closely on issues like the Greek crisis and other adjustment programs. And one must not forget that the crisis in 2008 was financial, was not of the same nature as the COVID crisis or the Ukraine crisis. And it's good that we've done our job, finally, to stabilize the financial system, because if we would have had a financial crisis to these crises, where would we be? But still, I think that the European authorities reacted too late, especially in terms of monetary policy, that it was slow, and we've lived through that. It took 10 years to emerge from the Greek crisis. It was tough. But during the COVID crisis and now with the Ukraine crisis, one thing which is a great asset for the EU is that our leaders, wherever they come from, have learned to react swiftly, rapidly, and together. And they have learned also that solidarity is a value that we must clearly share. Europe has been built through crises and has learned from its mistake and bounced back better. The health crisis was, to me, if not the perfect example, a good example. The EU has undeniably reacted with force and determination to this unprecedented challenge. I'm thinking in particular of the revolutionary plan for Europe, Next Generation EU. Is this the Hamiltonian moment for Europe? Not exactly. We've not built at the occasion of federal debt or a federal permanent budget, and we still have debates on what's the future of Next Generation EU, and we'll come back to it later. But for the first time, we've borrowed money together. We've acted through as well loans, but also grants. The plan was initially designed as a solidarity plan. I was in Rome last week. Well, the 200 billion euros dedicated to Italy versus reforms are more than welcome for the growth and resilience of the country, and also to help it to reform its structures. This is fully needed. And the amount of the plan is significant. And if we add the recovery plan at the EU level to national recovery plan, well, it is more or less comparable to what the US are doing. Of course, they wanted to do more, but due to the resistance of the Congress, well, let's say we are in comparable amounts. This is undoubtedly a measure that was eagerly awaited. It was awaited for 30 years. Jacques Delors emitted the idea of Eurobonds in 1992. It has been not totally unprecedented. The Juncker plan, in a way, was, I would say, the beginning of something like that. A pilot project, maybe, but the amount was also quite massive. And I think this is the major decision, which is also a paradigm shift for Europe. Today, more than ever, the Ukrainian crisis again demonstrates the European Union's ability to speak with one voice in times of crisis. The Union has undoubtedly reacted quickly and with strength to Russia's aggression by adopting new individual and collective economic measures with serious consequences for Russia. We don't know what the sanctions will create. It's always difficult to forecast. It depends on the resilience of the regime. It depends also on underlying forces in Russia. But they are certainly effective. They are certainly the most effective we ever decided. The 4 packages of sanctions already voted are a proof of the Union's ability to respond to this crisis, but also to innovate in this area. The EU is targeting the oligarchs, their financial investments in the Union and all over the world. In addition, there are punitive measures against Putin and those in his direct circle, as well as visa restrictions for Russian officials. In the economic field, the main sectors of the Russian economy are subject to targeted measures, such as oil refineries, the air fleet technology, the inclusion of some Russian banks, not all of them, because we need also to finance gas buying, since we have not decided to renounce to it, from the SWIFT network, and the ban on transaction by the Russian Central Bank are strong acts that mark the Union's determination on this issue. In an innovative mood and move, the EU has suspended the licenses of certain Russian propaganda media and prohibits overflight of EU airspace and access to EU airports for all types of Russian couriers. For the first time in European history, it's providing equipment and materials to the Ukrainian armed force through the European Peace Facility, which has also been raised by 500 million euros. And again, I think of our German friends who have shifted their traditional foreign policy by accepting to provide such equipments and to join the sanctions, especially on SWIFT, to suspend the Nord Stream 2 project, which is very decisive for the country, and also to decide to invest in their own defense. In addition to introducing unprecedented restrictions, the Union has demonstrated also its ability to cooperate in times of crisis, both within the EU and with partners. Some decisions I know were not easy to take at the EU level, not anymore in the meetings of the Council, but I can imagine some discussions there. We had to agree on the sanctions to be adopted, and the different situations of the member states sometimes can lead to diverging interests. Nevertheless, our values have been so deeply attacked that we have managed to come to an agreement and to overcome these divergences in interest. This is also a major achievement. Moreover, each of the measures adopted was taken with remarkable unity and in close coordination with the EU's partner. This has strengthened our ties with NATO member countries. The EU is actively working to prevent Putin's ambitions from spreading to other countries in Europe. This means that we are fully assuming our duty of assistance within NATO and supporting our allies in Central and Eastern Europe who fear for their security. And this is a signal which must be absolutely, totally firm and reaffirmed as many times as necessary. We must not only continue on this path, but also find a way out of the tragic situation of the Ukrainian people as soon as possible. Finally, Europe was able to take the right decisions to reduce its hazardous dependence on Russia, particularly in the field of energy. This is probably the key point. As I mentioned, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has pushed energy prices to unprecedented levels. While Europe currently has enough gas to see through the last few weeks of this winter, we're now in spring, it must now rebuild its reserves for next year. As a first step, the Commission intends to present a legislative proposals by April, making it mandatory for gas storage facilities to be filled to at least 90% of their capacity by the 1st October each year. In addition to filling the reservoirs, which is necessary, the Commission proposes to develop a Repower EU plan that will strengthen the resilience of the European energy system, based on mostly diversifying gas supply through increased liquefied natural gas. Finally, and turning more now to the future, I would like to talk about what we can do in this dramatic context. I will develop what I consider to be the main challenges for the European construction today. I mentioned Gramsci. I wanted to mention somebody else, maybe more mainstream. Not totally, because it's Winston Churchill. Never waste a good crisis. And this crisis must allow us to work collectively for the emergence and consolidation of a political Europe. Yes, a political Europe that is united, strong on its economic assets, and at the forefront of ecology, too. First of all, I would like to mention the issue of political and geopolitical Europe. As you know, the two last presidents of the Commission used these terms. Jean-Claude Juncker said, "We are a political Commission." And then Ursula von der Leyen says, "Now we are a geopolitical Commission." But the point is that we have never decided to have this step to think ourselves as a geopolitical and a political union. We've been built through the Jean Monnet method. We've been developing that a lot. But we've never said, okay, we are, sorry to say that it might sound very French, a power in this world. And now we are absolutely condemned to ask ourselves, how can we become a power in this dangerous world with new confrontations between superpowers? China, it's a global power. Russia, it's not a global power, but it's a military power with nuclear weapons. And you can see the fear and anxiety this raises around us, especially with the youngsters who suddenly discover it. If we are not a power, then we are just a collection of nation states, member states, very honorable, some of them with a special statute. This is the case for mine. France is a permanent member of the Security Council. It has the nuclear power. But if we are divided, then we're weak. Our unity is our strength. And this unity must be as well now political and geopolitical. And we absolutely need to build this political Europe, because it is impossible to carry out significant and meaningful reforms without a legitimate, democratic, and economic efficient governance. This is all the more necessary in the current context. The Union must act quickly, with unity and determination. The deepening of political Europe is the only way to achieve this, in my view. You said, dear President, that it would be a French voice. I hope not too French, because what I wanted is it to become really European altogether. It's not a matter of being a great France. No, I never shared this view. We thought that we need to make compromises between different nations with different cultures, and that was really my deep thinking in all my European career. But still, we are now confronted to this. So how? We must seize the current context to deepen the construction of a European defense. The community of democratic values, the area of peace and freedom that Europe represents, must be able to defend itself in close cooperation and in the framework of NATO. After the failure of the European defense community, so dear to Joseph Beck, who was Prime Minister of this country at the time, Europe has put this subject aside. European defense has been given new impetus since 2016, global strategies, the NATO Warsaw Summit, the Commission's European Defense Action Plan, the European Defence Fund, or the Coordinated Annual Defence Review have been promising initiatives. Nevertheless, it's clear to me that we must absolutely need to go further. The current crisis has made the strategic compass developed in peacetime obsolete. The first step is to strengthen our commitment. This can be done, in my view, through flexible mechanisms. You mentioned that, President. Bringing together states that want to go further on this subject. The referendum planned by Denmark to join the European defence policy is an example of how coalitions of voluntary states can be gradually enlarged according to the issues at stake. They're not yet planning a referendum to join the euro, but this is the example that might happen once There is no opt-out when history is so tragic. Of course, it's also a question of developing our strategic autonomy and our defense industry. And finally, we must strengthen our ties with our allies, first and foremost with the NATO countries and with the United States of America. I'm sorry, I'm now the chair of an independent body, Cour des Comptes, but I feel lucky that the president of the US today is not Donald Trump, but Joe Biden. That the president of the United States doesn't believe that Putin is a genius, but that he's somebody we need really to stop in this attack. In addition, I'm personally in favor of the emergence of a 35-member Europe. You might be surprised, but the question of the borders of Europe that we've left apart in 2007 is now knocking at our door. Because already there are countries which are candidates, we must not forget them, the countries from former Yugoslavia. And we've promised them a European future more than 20 years ago in Zagreb. But now we've also new candidacies from Ukraine, from Georgia, from Moldavia. I'm not saying that we need to accept them tomorrow. This wouldn't be realistic. This wouldn't be a gift for anybody. For those who have dealt with these negotiations, we know how hard the criteria are. And if you don't meet the criteria, how big the shock can be for the country which exceeds. But we must be opened, because we must tell them, you're with us in this new political and geopolitical union. You're part of us. We will defend ourselves together. And necessarily saying that, that raises another question. Okay, a 35-member states Europe, but what kind of Europe? And this poses another question, which is the idea of a multi-speed Europe with a strongly integrated epicenter, which would be the Eurozone, in my view. It already exists, and a wider geopolitical space. This epicenter, the euro area, will nonetheless have to reform itself and its institutions to improve its governance and efficiency. Some say, okay, what is core Europe? Joschka Fischer called about the avant-garde. Can it be France and Germany together? Well, obviously, they need to go alongside, but it's not enough anymore. Can it be the founders? Well, why the founders and not others? And this would totally exclude the so-called New Europe, those countries which join us. So there is no clear epicenter, except one, which we know is functioning, the Eurozone, with also its mechanisms. My experience, dear Klaus, and yours too, is that when the chair, the ECB, the ESM, the Commission, France, Germany, Italy and Spain go together, we have a deal. We can move on. This is efficient. And I never saw a veto in the Eurogroup. Never, ever. Well, we need to find compromises, but it's not the same as what we can do in the Council. In practice, I've been voting for this idea for a long time. Unanimous voting should be replaced progressively by qualified majority voting. I had the privilege to be a tax commissioner for the EU for 5 years. In this capacity, I could also have voted some 20 directives. It's unique, but I'm also conscious of the limits of what I've done with the member states, because these directives were on the field of fighting tax fraud and tax avoidance. When it came to structural reforms, let's say corporate tax, or energy, or digital, you could always find 2, 3, 4 countries not in agreement, and it was stopped and stalled. No, we must move progressively to qualified majority voting in all fields. And this includes, for me, social issues, foreign affairs issues, and tax issues. Secondly, the current crisis in the EU calls for strengthening of its energy and strategic independence. As I mentioned, the question of energy independence is a crucial issue in this period. In 2019, the EU depended on imports for 60% of its energy consumption, compared to 44% in 1990. Some countries depend almost exclusively on external resources of supply. It's the case for Malta, for Cyprus, for Finland, but also for Luxembourg. The Repower EU plan is, in my view, a big step forward on this issue, but it can only be the beginning of a way. It cannot be the end. I'm convinced that greater energy independence will be achieved through the transition to more sustainable energy. The issue of energy independence and the transition to a more sustainable system are just two sides of the same coin. The IB is deeply convinced of that. It has been involved in all the development mechanisms and also all the COP discussions. We are the major financiers of this at the world level, and we must stay at the forefront of this effort. We must be global leaders on energy and on ecology. Finally, in the new context of economic uncertainty, as I said, we must deepen the core of economic integration, that is the Eurozone, by moving forward on its governance and budget. I would say, if I could risk a formula, that the larger is the EU, the stronger must be its core, which is the Eurozone. If the COVID crisis have already led to the suspension of the SGP rules, I think that nobody must have a conclusion that we don't need rules anymore. I'm your colleague. I'm the president of the Cour des Comptes. It wouldn't be my job to say that. If you don't have rules, then you don't have any control. And at one moment, you are a victim of the markets. We need rules of public finances, but they need to be reformed. Today, they are complex, they are difficult to understand, they tend to be pro-cyclical. I think they are not adapted to this new period, which will be definitely marked by high debt and deficit levels. They could also cause a recessionary shock in the current period. In this context, I think we must reform them. The European Fiscal Board, chaired by Ms. Dickerson, have recently produced proposals insisting on the quality of public expenditures, the sustainability of debt. A reform of the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact could be based on a few principles. First, these rules could be adapted to the situation of each country. We must, I think, have more tailor-made rules, especially to their level of public debt, with a particular attention to the quality of public spending. Moreover, they should not be pro-cyclical. They should give a priority to investment or to some investments. I think first and foremost about green investment. And finally, they should rely more than today on the expertise of independent national budgetary institution, the EBI. This would give credibility to the scenarios and the possibility to assess the measures taken by member states. I consider these proposals to form an interesting path ahead. I think that my successor and friend Paolo Gentiloni is reflecting on this. I wish him good luck, and we need to move on. The success of the New Generation EU plan should also lead us to the creation of a real permanent budget, especially in the current context of changing monetary policy. To develop this budget, the EU's financing system should dispose of its own resources. We don't have them for the time being. I'm great sympathy for the plastic tax, but we must obviously be more ambitious, thinking about corporate tax, thinking about energy taxes, thinking about digital taxes, maybe in the framework of what is already been discussed in OECD meetings. And this also calls for a rise in the resources from 1.20 to 1.40% of EU gross national income. For those who fear that, let's be reassured, this is not a federal budget. We are not at all in the Hamiltonian moment, but we are moving to the necessary amount that we need. To conclude, I would like to recall the moral duty we have to stand up against this war. We're not in a war against Russia. That's important to say. We're not in a war against the Russian people, but there is a war in Europe provoked by this attack. As I said, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of all our values. As such, we must use all the means at our disposal to help Ukraine. This is our responsibility because this is the promise we made to Ukraine. Under the Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, we made a commitment to stand by this country. We must now commit to this engagement. Nevertheless, it's also a question of our survival as a union of democracies and our Enlightenment heritage. We must defend the ideals that led to the creation of our European Union and that today form the basis of our societies. Not to do so would mean the end of what we are doing together. And I think this was the first place where the European Parliament sat. Let's not forget it here. Furthermore, we are experiencing, as I said, this change of era, at this moment of change in our international system. It's time for Europe to redefine its position in the world. We must forge a new consensus for an international order based on multilateralism and the rule of law, with a cooperation that is effective and constructive. In my opinion, only a Europe that speaks the language of power, to quote not any French, but Joseph Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Policy, will be able to find its own place in this world of tomorrow. I will end with a quotation which is very famous, but I had the pleasure of meeting President Mattarella 1 week ago, and he said that precisely. He quoted Jean Monnet, who might be the ultimate father of the EU. Europe will be made in crises and will be the sum of the solutions brought to these crises. So famous, this quotation. More than ever, this maxim should inspire us. The solutions already found to the crises we are facing today and those to come will continue to build the EU and to make it even more sustainable, desirable, lovable. As a convinced and dedicated European, and I stay so in my present capacities, I strongly encourage you to take part in this beautiful and necessary project. I've been very happy to have the occasion to develop these few ideas before exchanges with you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, please keep your seats while the speakers take their seats on the stage.
Thank you very much, Mr Moscovici, for this excellent analysis of the present and the future of Europe. I think we all have learned, as far as we have not already learned it before, that you are convinced and a convincing European. And I think it could not be a better place for such a speech and now a discussion than this in this historic hemicycle, which was the former plenary of the European Parliament. And we have now the opportunity for having a discussion or for asking questions, and we have one moderator here among us, Mr. Wöstmann, who is taking all the online requests and will read them out. But of course, you as well here in the hemicycle have the opportunity to raise your hand. So if you have a certain question, please take the floor.
Thank you. Armand Kless, Monsieur Moscovici, I don't know if you remember, almost 13 years ago, in spring 2009, you published an article in Europe's World. It doesn't exist anymore, Child's Married, with the ominous title, How the EU's hubris has led us to the brink of nemesis. Do you remember this? I had forgotten it, but when I saw your name, I looked it up yesterday. And it's a very harsh and pessimistic indictment of what's going on in the context of the failed constitutional treaty and Lisbon Treaty, which was not a great success either, in your view. You talk about constitutional patriotism in this article, and you end your article by saying, I quote, the estrangement between the European Union and Europe's public opinions, the sceptics who govern us with impotence and cynicism. Perhaps hubris has finally delivered nemesis in the form of a union with our people, where treaties have replaced the spirit of Europe. the editor-in-chief, Charles Merritt, had asked me to write another article commenting yours mainly, but I agreed, unfortunately, with most of what you said. Just I said the future of Europe, of the EU, is stasis, stagnation, not nemesis. So would you be, are you still as pessimistic almost 13 years later? And I have a small question to add directly about what you said about strategic autonomy, which is a French idea now because your president has brought it up. But I want to ask you, you favor strategic autonomy, but you want to keep NATO. But isn't that the old dilemma, the old predicament? Can there, I put it very simply, can there be really strategic autonomy for the EU in an alliance with NATO? And my last question or remark is about something that moves us all, the Russian, what is called the Russian onslaught on Ukraine. I wonder, and I would like to hear from you, whether we in Western Europe, in the West, in the Atlantic world, have not also failed by omitting to build 30 years ago, when the Soviet Union broke down, a more stable European order where Russia would also have had its place, as it was the idea of Gorbachev with a common European house. Sorry, I hope I was not too long. I know this is, I asked a lot of substance and...
Shall we collect? Okay. Then I would just ask Mr. Westman, because probably there are as well other people online, so we should just change from online to the plenary and then back, please. Micro, please.
We have a large number of online participants and a large number of questions coming in all the time. One of the questions is relating to the budget you mentioned. What should be the new budget rules? Another question, if I may, completely unrelated, is what should be the role of Turkey in the new order? Another question is relating to a completely new subject, IT. What should the European Union do to develop its IT capacities and capabilities, to develop against cybercrime and so on and so forth?
Okay, plenary again. Please.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring exposé. My name is Hilde Herdeman. I'm the Director General of the European Union's Publications Office. Our role is to make it known to the public what the EU does and means for them. I have a very practical question for you. You have spoken about a turning point, and indeed, I think that we are at this stage where we need a different vision for Europe, a stronger vision. I would have a very practical question for you, and I do not at all mean this question in a cynical way, but I would like to ask you, what would you see as the main obstacles to overcome in realizing the type of vision that you have put forward? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Shall we do a break for these questions?
I don't remember this article. One thing I must say is that I'm expressing myself it's in my personal capacity. I'm not committing any French position. What I say here is just my personal view. Sometimes it's, most of the time, it's in agreement with the authorities of my country, but sometimes it can slightly differ, not against, but with some nuances that I could develop here or there. No, I don't remember this article, but I remember being in the late first decade of the century in quite pessimistic mood for two reasons. At the moment, the first one was the failure of the Constitutional Treaty. It happens that I've also been a member of the European Convention. I was the French representative for the European Convention in 2002, 2003. I was deeply committed in the idea of a Constitutional Treaty. I think that it would have been great for us to have, I would say, the backbone of a political vision and political rules, which would have been much stronger than the one we have. The Lisbon Treaty finally picked in the treaty most of the institutional disposals of the Constitutional Treaty, but not with the same strengths. And for a Frenchman, it caused some problems since the Constitutional Treaty had been rejected by referendum, and the other treaty has been adopted by parliamentary discussion, so it created a huge frustration. And the second reason was, of course, that we were in the beginning of the financial crisis, and we didn't have, at the moment, I think, the weapons or tools to address this crisis. I'm much more optimistic, as I said, now, today, since I think that we've learned from these crises. We've learned from the financial crisis, and we've built the tools that really are strong now. We've learned from the Greek crisis. I'm hopeful that we would never reproduce some of the mistakes that were initially made against Greece. I remember with Jean-Claude Juncker, when he was nominated as the chair of the Commission, I was commissioner in charge of the negotiations with Greece, and it happens that I went there 16 times. Our first decision was to say, no more troika. It will be the institutions there. We will be in a totally different mood of dialogue versus the government. Whoever governs the country, it's not a question of preference between the left and the right. We wanted it to be more human, and finally we could convince. We were a bit alone in the beginning. And we've learned through the COVID crisis, and again, Next Generation EU to me is a revolution. Of course, it was not starting from scratch. The Juncker Plan was a very strong initiative, but it was one step forward, obviously. And the reaction versus the Ukraine crisis is swift and strong. So, no, I'm not as pessimistic as I was. But let's pay attention. Let's not be over-optimistic. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us. We must never stop in the bicycle, or else, as Joel said, it falls. If we, at one moment, feel released, say, okay, now it's quieter time, let's smooth things, let's slow down. No, we need really to build this political and geopolitical Europe. And we need to have strong impetus, strong leadership, strong will. And so we must have this optimism of the will. And it must be the time also for an intense debate. About NATO, and that's where I said I was expressing myself personally. I do not see a contradiction between being members of NATO and developing a European defense. We must obviously do both. If we are just members of NATO without any European dimension, I think we are lacking something. We are lacking strategic autonomy. We are lacking the capacity to take our own decisions. And we must also learn to count on ourselves. But on the other hand, we cannot have a European defense without NATO. That is very clear. This alliance is a huge, massive protection for us. And it will emerge stronger from this crisis than it was before. Everybody rediscovers the need for NATO. So we must, I think, move on these 2 feet altogether. Then, I'm not a strategic expert, I'm not a military expert, and even if I was, I would be careful. I wouldn't say the European defense is the European pillar of NATO. That's one version. Is it more? Is it less? We'll have to see exactly where we stop. But we must develop both. On Russia, this is a major question. Some conservative academics write a lot about that, say that we are responsible for what's happening because we have not involved Russia in the European framework, or because we have made promises to Ukraine to belong to NATO, and that finally we should have been more careful. I'm not at all in this mood, not at all. I think that if we would have not proposed to Ukraine to join once, not tomorrow, NATO. If we wouldn't have admitted the new EU members simultaneously to NATO, it would have been a terrible mistake, and this wouldn't have prevented us from any attack. This would just make the attack closer to us, the possibility of the attacks closer to us. So no, I don't have any kind of regret of that sort. But it's true that for those like me who are now not at the end, but closer to the end of political life than to its beginning, when we were members of the European Parliament together in 1994, well, it was another Russia. We hoped that Boris Yeltsin, that after all was the guy who pushed the Soviet Union apart, would be a Democrat. We've bet one way or another on oligarchs, thinking that, well, okay, they might be corrupt and they may build a lot of wealth artificially, but they are also attached to liberal values. We thought that progressively Russia would move toward that. But at one moment, it happened that they chose a leader, Vladimir Putin, who comes from the security services and who had this nostalgia since the beginning of the Soviet influence and who wanted to restore, as a historical project, this capacity to have influence over this space. And a part of this space is inside the EU. So it's always necessary to discuss with Russia. I think that we must have diplomatic links with them. I think it's relevant to have discussions with Vladimir Putin. I think that in the end, situations always find diplomatic solutions, or else we're in a total impasse. But we must do that on our values. And again, we are not responsible for what has happened in Russia. We didn't choose this leadership, we didn't choose this mindset. And so we are right to defend our own interests. It would be preferable that things move differently. We'll see what happens in the future. But, well, for the time being, we were, I think, rightly positioned. For the rules, I touched upon it. My small experience is that treaty change is complicated, that there is not a huge appetite for that in the EU. And so I think that we must change practices. We must change the implementation of the rules. That's what we tried to do with flexibility, for example, in the previous Commission. But we must go further. I'm not advocating to say that the Maastricht criteria are obsolete. 3% makes sense. 60% also might make sense. It might make sense for Luxembourg, who is at 30%. It makes sense for France at 113%. But I'm afraid that I won't see that in my lifetime, even if I live long, which I hope. And so it can be something as a reference, but this is not something that is operational tomorrow. This is why I called for a more individualized addressing to the question of debt. This doesn't mean that you don't deal with debt. I was always convinced that we must deal with debt. And of course, the more indebted you are, the more you must be committed to efforts. That is clear. But you must have a more, as I said, tailor-made approach. Turkey. This is a very, very delicate matter. I spoke about borders. It happens that, you know, when you have a long political life, you need to look at your own coherence. I'm afraid that I must reckon that I was in the room in Helsinki when in 1999 we admitted Turkey as a candidate to the EU. And let's not forget that it is a candidate to the EU. At the time, this was an initiative led by both President Chirac and Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, because they thought, and everybody thought finally, it was a bit difficult for Kostas Simitis, the then Greek Prime Minister, that it would be good to attract Turkey to our values and that they would be better with us in the EU, even if the problem existed to have 70 million Muslims in the EU, then to tell them you have nothing to do with us and move to Islamism. The bet has been lost. Turkey cannot accede to the EU now, obviously. When Erdogan came into power, said, who pretended that his party was the equivalent in Turkey as CDU. It was not Christian Democrat. It was Muslim moderate. It was not moderate. It's not the equivalent of CDU. And you can see that he has, or derived, as also an at least illiberal Democrat regime. It's still Democrat because there are elections in Turkey, which are still close. And he can lose the elections. He lost the municipal elections as well in Ankara, Izmir, and Istanbul, and he could lose the next presidential election. Even if he changes the rules, well, there are still the basis for that. Even if, well, independence of justice or freedom of media is not, that's the least we can say, perfect. But let's observe where Turkey is today in this conflict. Basically sticking to NATO and wanting to make efforts to be in constant dialogue with Europe. We must take that into account. Personally, I'm no more favorable to the accession of Turkey because I think it's not possible, but I was never in the idea that we should break the negotiations. I thought for a long time that those negotiations have changed their meanings, that now they are the way to show to the part of Turkey which is attracted to Europe that we are still in constant dialogue. I think it's maybe time to invent a new kind of relationship with Turkey. Maybe. But let's not break with them. Certainly not. They are a necessary partner. And they could be also a part of the solution with this Ukrainian war. So I'm no more a strong believer in the Turkish accession for a long time now. It was a bet. Didn't work. But I'm not either in the idea that we must have no relationship with Turkey. There is a part of Turkey geographically, politically, which is very close to Europe. If you're in Istanbul, you're in Europe. If you talk to the opposition, you're in Europe. Even one border of Istanbul is Taksim and the other is the mosque. So it's a very split country. So these cleavages must be taken into account. For IT capacities, this must be clearly a part of the investment we must make and the rapprochement we must have together. And finally, what about the obstacles? Well, we know them well. What are the obstacles? I would say, first, the relative weakness of our institutions still. We don't have, yet, the institutions that are strong enough to govern, to lead such a complex union. And I think we should reinforce them all. Robert Badinter, who was a famous minister and thinker in France, said that it's the best synthesis between federalism and intergovernmentalism. We cannot be purely federalists. I used to be, but well, it can't work at 27, it won't work at 35. But we need to reinforce our common institutions, reinforce the ECB, that has been done already, reinforce the Commission, reinforce the Parliament. I'm a strong believer in the role of the Parliament. When I came back in 2004, it was not the same Parliament as we've known together in 1994. It's a co-legislator. It must go on. But we must also reinforce the Council, change the rules. I talked about qualified majority voting. So weakness is the first obstacle. And the second is division. Division. We know that. I spoke about Next Generation EU and said how impressed I was about that. But I cannot forget also the discussions, which were harsh against the Frugals and the others. I cannot defend hawks and doves. Well, at one moment we must be conscious that we have such a common ground that we cannot stick to our national interest too much. If we don't forget that, if we forget that, then we cannot make it. So weakness and division are the two main obstacles we must absolutely overcome if we want to be capable of building the future of Europe I dream of.
Thank you very much. So now we have still some time for the next round. Please, Frank Sauer.
Thank you very much. My name is Casala, and I'm a member of the College of the European Court of Auditors. Thank you very much for this very inspiring speech. I, of course, will join my thanks to those already expressed. And there are many issues on which we would like to continue the discussion. I will focus on one particular, which is close to our common professional activity, that is the EU budget, and what you described as the need for more own resources. As you know better than me, the proportion of own resources and, as we say, traditional own resources was even higher 40 years ago than it is now. So it's a kind of dilemma, because all the past show that the own resources have diminished for many reasons, which are probably linked to the obstacles you just mentioned. So you mentioned the need for more European taxes. I can understand that, but it's also understood by by the public opinion, as well as by governments, like an additional layer of taxes on an already sometimes overly weight proportion of taxes in a lot of countries. So I see hardly how this can, or we can move forward on this issue regarding this, in particular if I take, for example, our common country. So how do you see the possibility or the way forward in terms of getting more own resources, and in particular taxes in this context? Thank you.
Thank you. Then the next question, again from our online participants.
They're also very much interested in tax issues. One direction of questions is, what measures in fiscal harmonization would you expect, or can we expect, between now and 2030? And another tax issue is concerning large corporations who are able to go for tax optimization, which is not the case for SMEs. What can be done about this, and what can be done to make SMEs nevertheless more competitive in this context?
Okay, I saw you over there, please.
This is in respect of expenditure. What about the cost of reconstruction of Ukraine once the country is again going to be pacified? To what extent would you expect that to hit the European budget? We're probably talking about something in the order of $200 billion. The Ukrainians are already mentioning 120 of so far incurred economic damage. And what is the context with the European sequestering of Russian central bank assets, which miraculously amount to $310 billion? Would you expect those funds to be earmarked towards the reconstruction of Ukraine, and in an interim period to pay for Ukrainian refugees as they affect the budgets of member states? Thank you.
Another question? Or, okay, because it is over there, and please.
Thank you. You called for a more powerful and political EU. Do you think that France should share both its nuclear weapon and a permanent seat at the UN with the other member states? Thanks.
Thank you. And then the last question for.
Thank you very much. Oops. My question is related to effectiveness of the sanctions against Russia, because probably for the Russian government it's not very important, the sanction, and the Russian government doesn't think about the people in Russia. And therefore, in my view, we should do much more in the way of reduction of the energy, like stop buying this amount of energy from Russia. And you mentioned one way is transaction of to other sources. Therefore, my question is whether we consider nuclear power. So Germany changed the policy, so now we don't have many nuclear stations in Germany, but in my view, like, it's better to have a danger of nuclear accidents and finance now the war in Ukraine. This is the first issue. The second issue is, or the second question is whether we consider the reduction of the consumption of energy, because one way is to replace it, but it needs some time. But a reduction of energy, we can go quicker to this. For example, even if in European Union policy, I see a lot of wastage. We have some buildings in Kirchberg, which may be not necessary. The functionary now obliged to go to the office, which also leads to additional transportation, additional energy waste in the building. So which policy do we have in the way of reduction of consumption? Yeah, thank you.
I know, dear François Roger, how delicate is the question of taxes. As a former finance minister, I had to suffer a lot from that. And I believe that there is a moment when you cannot pay more taxes, that the capacity to absorb additional taxes is limited. So that means that you must not only reflect on taxes as additional taxation, but sometimes to substitute some sources of taxation to other resources. That's one point. The second point is that you must be very conscious when you define taxation system of the political capacity to implement these taxations. Some of them might not be tolerated. I'm not that sure that additional VAT or income tax for financing Europe would be creating a lot of enthusiasms, but other might be rather more relevant. And we'll talk, for example, about the digital tax. When I proposed two directives on the digital tax as a tax commissioner, the idea was to be fully in the frame of the BEPS discussions led by OECD under the umbrella of the G20, and the idea that, some companies don't pay their fair share of tax where they create income and profits. As far as we know, the tech giants pay some 9% corporate tax, whilst the SMEs mentioned already pay some 23%. That's not level playing field, and it must be recognized that worldwide. So I think that we have got several discussions that can be led there. I remember as tax commissioner that I had some regrets. I could not really propose anything on energy. There was not even a consensus in the Commission, and there was not a consensus all over the place. And so, I think now the agenda can be settled, since we've got as well the question of reducing our dependence to some sources of energy, and also the need to finance the Green Deal, which is, I think, a very consensual approach, an ambitious one. But we need simultaneously to think about how to compensate some inconvenience for citizens. So on the one hand, you've got resources, on the other hand, you will have some expenditures that need to be deployed. And so I think these, energy on one hand and digital on the other hand, or corporate, are very good candidates for working on it. But that's not my job anymore. But we cannot avoid thinking about that. And we've got, I think, a quite strong momentum with the Next Generation EU plan, with the need to finance, obviously, major sources of expenditure for the future, and with also the discussions led in OECD, which have moved in the right direction. As you know, they have designed a two-pillar approach, one designing a nexus, meaning a way to tax all the corporates. This includes digital. And on the other hand, a minimum tax of 15%. This is minimum, but it's higher than some countries inside the EU. And it can be maybe raised in the future if it works. And I think that the EU must take its specific legislation in that framework, because you cannot have a legislation which is worldwide or with 130 or so countries. So there is a way to move forward. I know how complex it is. But my experience as a Commissioner for Tax is that you must always seize the momentum. As I told you, I had the privilege to propose 20 directives which were voted. I remember when Jean-Claude Juncker nominated me as tax commissioner. I didn't know. I knew that I was going to be economy and finance commissioner, but he didn't tell me about tax. And a few years after, he announced that in the press conference. And a few years after, I asked him, why didn't you tell me? He said, it's because I was afraid you would refuse. And I must say that it was not a very exciting portfolio. When I was finance minister, my predecessor, Mr. Shemeta, came to see me in Bercy. Bercy is a very prestigious place, seat of the finance minister. And my people working with me, do I really need to meet him? Yes, minister. Okay. So I spent an hour with him, and he told me about VAT on horses. Nothing went out of it. And I had the privilege to have 20 directives. Why so? Not because I'm better than he was, but because the momentum was different. There were scandals, LuxLeaks, and Swiss Leaks, Panama Papers. Each time we see the opportunity to have, okay, one scandal, one directive. Today it's not about scandals, it's about opportunities. And so we must seize the opportunity. So if I've got a message to my successor and friend, Paolo Gentili, don't waste time. It's now. Seize the opportunity. Move on to create that. If you come that in 2 years, too late. Too late. So don't waste time. About Ukraine, I think there are people here like Werner or Klaus that could give a better answer than I could about how to finance reconstruction of Ukraine. We'll have to take our share. I don't think this would be about necessarily EU budget money. Some financing, but, well, then you need to imagine what it will be. Let's wait a moment to know exactly what will be the amount and what will be our role and what the international community will decide on it, because this is something which is, of course, relying on us, but not only on us, it's worldwide, obviously. But we can imagine some funds. And about funds, it's also a bit early to think about it. And in Versailles, it was just mentioned, but maybe early to discuss about a resilience fund or defense fund. But at one moment, we will need to see where we go. But first, let's move to substance. Before saying we need a fund, let's ask ourselves, how much do we need and what for? And then adapt the tools. And we've got now several ways to address these issues. If I want to go back to France tomorrow, in full security, I cannot tell you that we need to share our nuclear weapon and our permanent seat in the UN. It happens that I don't believe it. I don't believe that we need to share it, so it's more comfortable for me. But you know, that's the ultimate crime for a politician, either from Germany or from France. Well, no, France is not going to renounce to any of it. But I think we need to think about that a bit differently, about what is our responsibility towards the others. When President Mitterrand said that France was concerned about SS-20 and that France should be committed and its nuclear weapon should be committed to defense of Germany, it was in the early 80s. That was an historical move. So we must know what this nuclear weapon stands for. It's not only for our own interest, it's also for the interest of Europe. So you don't share the decision-making. Why so? Not for decades, maybe. But you certainly have talks, discussions about the use of it. And for the permanent seat, you need also to use that with responsibility, to be always in consultation with your partners. That's the way it can be. 30 years from now, maybe we can discuss that. But first and foremost, I think the reasoning that I applied 1 minute ago about the fund must be applied there. Before telling nuclear weapon will be shared or the seat, what are we doing with political Europe? The day we have a political Europe, sorry to say that, to share a seat in the UN or to share nuclear weapon decision, you need to have a state. The day Europe is a state, we will discuss it. It's not the case for the time being. I think everybody can understand that. Then, about nuclear energy, it certainly is an asset for a country, for example, like mine, to have nuclear energy. And I'm not commenting on the decisions taken by other countries to renounce to it. There are also good reasons to renounce to it. That means that the question of security in nuclear energy must always be present in any kind of decision. President Emmanuel Macron decided to launch a new investment plan in nuclear energy. Of course, you need to do that with new reactors. You need to make sure that there are no side effects and that security is fully on board. And then you also need to reduce your consumption. Maybe we will have less heat next winter in our homes. We just have enough, I think. But this is obviously a part also of strengthening our independence, and the right to raise this issue about reducing consumption. The ways for independence, again, I'm not either an energy specialist. As the privilege to be in our office is that we discuss with a lot of specialists of a lot of things with our reports. How can we do? First, we can develop alternative energies. That is the case for renewables first. It can be the case for nuclear, but that's a highly sensitive point. On the other hand, you can also diversify your sources for gas and oil. And third, you can reduce your consumption. Obviously, if you want to have a strong plan for recovering your independence, you must do the three at the same time.
Thank you. I'm taking a look at the organizers. Do we still have enough time for the next round? That's fine. Okay, then we just do it. Please, online first, and then we continue.
Out of the large number of more detailed questions, I have one that sticks out and offers a broader subject. You mentioned Asia, America, who both are looking the other way very often when we talk about Europe. How about Africa? Where do you see relations develop between Europe and Africa over the next period of years?
Okay, there was some over there, please, and then you, please.
Hello. Yes, there is a video of former President of the United States, Donald Trump, on Twitter. It was a trend topic a few weeks ago. And it was a video of a meeting with the Secretary General of NATO. And he was criticizing European Union and European leaders, European countries. And he was saying that United States used to spend more than 4% of its budget to protect Europe from Putin and from Russian Federation, although European countries was paying billion and billion dollars to the Russian Federation to make it stronger. And there were some comments on it and giving right to him just after the war. And also, according to some figures from the 2014 up until now, more or less 10 European countries would have sold almost $500 million worth weapons to the Russian Federation. And also including in these countries, including Germany and France. And also just after the Crimea war or annexation, excuse me, France cancelled its cell to worship to Russian Federation. I want to ask this question. Although all the evidence were there, for example, Russian Federation divided Georgia, annexed Crimea, they were very active in Syria. Although all the evidence were there, what is the reason of the failure to assess the right intention and this aggressive attitude of Russia? What is the exact reason of this misassessment from the European side of Russian Federation? Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. You mentioned that in this century Europe faced a lot of crises and learned from the crisis. However, don't you see that acting and reacting on crisis put too much effort and too much attention into the short term and the need to solve and to address this crisis? Therefore, which is the medium long-term view for Europe, which is the, let's say, the strategic positioning of Europe in this century, compares, for instance, to China and US, which seems to have clear in mind which is, let's say, their position in the geopolitical and economic challenges.
Thank you very much. I have a question that may be a bit more administrative than political or geopolitical, and that is about the role of supreme audit institutions, in particular the Cour des Comptes or the French or the European Court of Auditors, and what can they do better? What's their relevance and their role in this new area of crisis that you're describing?
Thank you very much. And then.
Thank you very much, Mr Moscovici. So relations with the Russian Federation are broken, but what will or should happen with the links with the Russian people? For instance, can Europe invite, incentivize young Russian citizens that may now more than ever, actually in their lifetime, feel trapped or lacking opportunities to undertake, innovate, and participate to a more inspiring project than the one the Kremlin has to offer? Thank you.
Okay, please.
I could be very long on Africa because this is a decisive continent. We've discussed that with Werner Hoyer so many times in so various meetings, whether they are bilateral or between the EU and the EIB or at the IMF level. And the efforts made by the EIB are remarkable, in close link with the National Promotional Bank or Banks for Development all over Europe. But just a few ideas. For us, Africa is absolutely decisive for various reasons. Because first, it's the continent of the future. That's where the future of the world population is. Because it has a high development potential. And because it's also strategically decisive for us, because we are living on the other side of the Mediterranean. And we don't need to have any kind of colonial nostalgia to say that. Let's also look at the fact that other people have understood that. The Chinese are investing massively in Africa. The Russians are present. And they're present also with strange military forces. If you look at one country in which France has been involved a lot in the last decade, Mali. Now you've got this Wagner army who is sitting very close to the new junta there. And for all these reasons, development, democracy, economic interest, future, yes, we need to invest massively in this continent, I'm quite sure. Do we do enough? Never. We do a lot. Again, we are also, by far, the biggest financiers of development policies in the world. But we need to do more. I think we need to be more volunteer, more aggressive in that field. There are a lot of ways to do that, but thank you for asking the question. It certainly is absolutely decisive. On the miscalculations or the misunderstanding of Putin's intention, a lot of people thought about it for a long time. And it's clear that it didn't start on the 24th of February. There was Crimea, there was Donbass, Lugansk there. But very frank, who could say the day before the guy is going to invade Ukraine tomorrow? We all still lived in this world post-1990, where we thought that a lot of things were possible, that we had to deal with autocrats, that finally war in Europe would not happen. One might say that's also what we thought in 1914 or in 1933. Okay, but it's no time for regret. It's time for response. I don't see who was the visionary in the government somewhere, even if the US had obviously better information than us in Europe about that. Well, okay. Now, we must absolutely know that we are going to live with that for a long time. I don't know how long this war will endure, but I know that the threat will be there for a long time. And we must be also conscious that even as far as nuclear weapons are concerned, the doctrine is slightly changing, that the use of nuclear weapon, I wouldn't say is likely, I would want to seem alarming, but it's not impossible anymore. And so we need to have a lot of strategic thinking now, a lot. And we must not, again, be released if things go better in 3 months or 6 months from now. We've got to live with that for long. And so let's not be surprised once again. Everybody's been surprised. Not surprised, but thought, no, in the end, it's not going to happen. It happened. So we know that this creates a new era. And this is why the 24th of February is such a turning point for us in Europe and in the world. It's right that the idea that we are just responding to crisis is insufficient. But why can it be sufficient this time? Because, as Jean-Claude Juncker said, we are not living in an ordinary crisis. We are living in a polycrisis. All dimensions are there. If you look at the last decade, starting in 2008, financial crisis, Greek crisis, migration crisis, climate crisis, sanitary crisis, fiscal crisis, economic crisis. 2020 was the worst year since the beginning of the 20th century. It was worse than 1929 as a recession. And now, military crisis. They're all there. So responding to the polycrisis means giving a poly-response. It means that you need to think globally. You cannot address one crisis after one crisis. You need to address them all together. That's why I'm a bit more optimistic. About SAIs, Dear President, you could give a better answer than I do. Our role, I think, is as well modest, but also decisive. It's modest because we are not the most vocal institutions of the world. It's, as you said, administrative. No, it's a bit more than that. What is our role? First, I think we need to be there to stand by the governments, to tell them how they can spend the money properly, with as well probity, honesty, but also rationality and efficiency. And so for that, auditing is decisive. I'm not among those who believe that auditing is something which is a pain in the ass for management. It's a strong help for better decision making. That's the first thing that we can do. The second thing is that it's also a part of democracy to have an independent authorities. Because it means that you have control It's a part of the control of the executive. And it depends on our positioning. Some are jurisdictional, some are close to the parliament, some close to the government, some are independent. We all are independent, one way or another. That's decisive. So we are a part of the democratic debate. And so the third role I would identify is addressing the citizen. We need to deliver messages to the citizens. For example, in my capacity as chair of the Cour des Comptes, I just created on the 9th of March a platform open to citizens for them to propose us some themes of control. And since then, I see a lot of proposals emerging from the citizens' debate. So it depends also on the strengths of our institution. For example, the French Cour des Comptes is very well known. 90% of the French know us, 70% have a good opinion of us, because we are old, we are ancient, we are part of the... everybody knows the Cour des Comptes for a long time. For others, it's a bit more difficult. But I think those three roles are certainly fundamentals. And then the last question about the Russian citizens. It's decisive, not easy, but decisive. It's decisive since the power completely been confiscating freedom of speech, pluralism of media, and even social media. But let's not believe that they are totally unaware of what's happening. And we must keep that in mind, because there is a future for Russia too. There is a future for Europe and Russia together. There is a future for our relationship with Russia. And that's why I think it's wise to say that we are not at war against Russia. They're certainly not at war against the Russian people. If they would know, probably they know, they cannot be satisfied with that posture of Vladimir Putin. Because as far as we know, if information is correct, about 10,000 Russian soldiers died on the field. The Russian people were told, we are moving to Kiev and we'll be welcomed with flowers by brothers. That's not what happened. On the contrary, there is a fantastic nation building for Ukraine, which always was a divided country. And so we must do our best efforts to inform the Russian people, to think about their future, and their future closer to us. I don't know who is responsible. I answered that. I know who is not responsible for the fact that we missed the closer relationship with Russia in the 90s. In the future, we must think about it, sincerely. That doesn't mean Russia is a member of the EU, but that means that we must also try to build a common framework that includes Russia. President Mitterrand, in the 90s, early 90s, he had an idea, which was to create a confederation. It was a strange idea, part of vision and I think part of mistake, because it was part of vision, the idea that we must have a broad circle with other countries, and that included all the applicant countries plus others. It was strange because he excluded the US and included Russia. We must not exclude the US. But at one moment, we must create something that includes Russia and the Russian people. But, well, first of all, we must respond with total firmness to this dramatic situation, with unity, solidarity, and then try to build a common response to this poly-crisis we're in. We are living through tragic times. This cannot bring us to optimism, which would be naive. Let's not be naive. But I still have the optimism of the will. I think that we can have a better world than the world we're living in, and that still Europe as a model to deliver. But for that, we need to strengthen it, and that's still our task.
Thank you very much, Mr Moscovici. The applause simply proves that this was not only a very interesting speech, but as well a very, very motivating, interesting discussion. And I'd like to say thank you very much on behalf of all the audience online as well as in presence. And I as well like to say thank you to you all for your participation and wish you a nice evening. Thank you.
Refreshments are going to be served on the ground floor, same floor as the entrance, which is on the lift -1.